Iran signs 21 cooperation agreements with African countries. Wrapping up a three-nation trip to the continent, Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi confirms more than $2 billion in trade for this year. It's the first visit to Africa from an Iranian leader in more than a decade. So why the push now to strengthen Tehran's African ties? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Raisi's Africa visit. Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi received the red carpet treatment as he arrived in Kenya last week. It was his first stop on a three-nation tour of Africa that is said to be a new beginning in Tehran's relations with the continent. It's also the first official visit by an Iranian president in more than a decade. At its core, Raisi's diplomatic mission is to diversify Iran's economic ties in the face of crippling sanctions. In 2018, then U.S. President Donald Trump ditched the JCPOA nuclear pact and imposed sanctions on Iran.
Iran has acted very badly.
And the U.S. has subjected Iran to a new bout of sanctions for allegedly supplying Russia with drones that have been used in Ukraine. Now, this has prompted Iran to step up its diplomatic outreach to developing countries.
Us, two countries, are against sanctions. And we believe that sanctions are a tool for the Americans, like a military tool that they use against nations.
Well, on his visit, Raisi also emphasized conservatism, family values, and anti-colonialism. During his meeting in Uganda, he stressed that the Islamic Republic and certain African countries have not only trade in common, but they actually share many similar social ideals.
These strong attacks by the West against the establishment of families and against the culture of the nations is another area of cooperation for Iran and Uganda.
But ultimately, the visit came down to trade agreements. Iranian and Kenyan ministers signed 5 memorandums of understanding encompassing information technology, fisheries, livestock products, and investment promotion. Then Raisi met his Ugandan counterpart, Yoweri Museveni, in Kampala. There, they signed 4 cooperation agreements on visa waivers, agricultural cooperation, and the formation of a joint permanent intergovernmental commission. And finally, Iran and Zimbabwe signed 12 agreements in multiple sectors, including energy, pharmaceuticals, and science and technology.
We have signed a record of 12 MOUs. I have no doubt, and I assure you, my dear brother, that on our side in Zimbabwe, we shall religiously follow up these MOUs for the benefit of the two republics, but in particular for us in Zimbabwe to tap into the technological advancement which your country has achieved.
So what really stands to be gained through these growing ties between Tehran and Africa? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Tehran, Iranian affairs analyst and professor at Tehran University, Mohammad Marandi. From London is Agnes Gitau, executive director at Eastern African Association and board member of GBS Africa. And from Abuja is Alex Vines, head of the Africa program at Chatham House. Thanks all so much for being with me. Alex, when President Raisi says he wants to expand Iran's strategic depth on the African continent, what does that mean? How much do they really have to offer each other, especially when it comes to trade?
Well, the Iranian trade figures with Africa are small, about $2 billion a year. And so Tehran is basically looking at new markets. It's very constrained by US and EU sanctions. And so 54, 55 African countries is something that's a priority for Tehran. And so that's what this recent trip of the president of Iran has been all about to Uganda, Kenya and Zimbabwe. It's been about looking at opportunities for trade, but also looking at opportunities of isolating US and EU sanctions, particularly Zimbabwe, which is also under sanctions.
Right. I mean, describe a little bit more about what strategic depth could actually qualify as.
Well, Iran is offering agricultural extension. It's obviously got drone technology. We've heard a lot about that recently in terms of the military side of that with the war in Ukraine. But there's a civil side too in terms of agricultural monitoring. I've seen that there's been an announcement of Iran looking at expanding its kind of opening a shipping office in Africa. And also there's been a talk of bartering petrochemical products for food in the African continent. I mean, bear in mind that the economy at the moment in Iran is really suffering 70 to 100% inflation. And so really trying to get any extra economic growth is really important for Tehran.
Mohammad Marandi, do you agree there? And also explain why specifically Uganda, Kenya, and Zimbabwe?
Geographically speaking, East Africa is very important for Iran. It's also very convenient. And I was on the trip with the president. These countries are very rich in resources. They're all beautiful countries, but Uganda, in my opinion, was particularly beautiful. And I think tourism is another attraction there. But their agricultural goods, livestock, is something that the Iranians are very keen on importing because they're less expensive. Iran purchases livestock from Australia, it purchases agricultural goods from Europe and countries in Latin America, and these countries are much less expensive. And the Iranians have a lot of industrial goods and high-tech goods that they can export. The Iranian goods are much cheaper than Western goods, and these countries are interested in importing from Iran. So it cuts costs for Iran, and it also provides an opportunity for exporting. And as your guest rightly pointed out, the Iranians are looking for increased cooperation with countries in the global south in order to weaken the U.S. hand. And since the world is changing very rapidly as we speak, Africa is playing a much more prominent role, and that is something that Iran welcomes, and Iran thinks that it is a good moment for it to use this opportunity to expand relations, in particular with East Africa. Kenya, of course, being a business hub, has its own significance as well.
Right. And let me turn to Agnes about that. And also, Agnes, as we know, there's long been this criticism of the economic relationship between the West and Africa as one of the West stripping the continent of natural resources while adding no jobs or real value to African economies. Will Iran be different, and how so?
Thank you very much, Andrea. I don't think so. I think for me, as we can spend all day speaking about these opportunities being for Iran to expand its export market, and also for the countries they visited, Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, for their to grow their trade relations. But I'm sure this is just what the three leaders or the four leaders want us to hear. It's very strategic. It comes at a time when we're seeing a shift in Western powers. It is an opportunity, for my view, for Iran to position itself and get new allies as the geopolitics changes, but also for these countries. Kenya, we have a new president. He's barely been in power for close to a year now. Uganda facing challenges at home because of Museveni's term and lack of term limit. And you know the story of Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe. So clearly, these are people, sometimes you get judged by the friends you keep. Iran and human rights challenges, human rights issues, and the sanctions with the US. For me, yes, it is great to expand market. It is great to diversify Africa's export market. However, these relations need to be seen, or this current movement by different leaders from across, we've seen Russians, we've seen Chinese, need to be viewed from, particularly by the Africans, needs to be viewed with a bit of care. so that we do not make the same mistake we continually blame the West of the economic ties being not equal.
Right.
So my point is we have to tread carefully and ensure that it's beyond what we are being told.
It's interesting you say, Agnes, that you should be sometimes judged by the friends you keep. Let me get Alex's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. So look, this isn't just a competition with the West. So I think Agnes is kind of, alluding to that. This is also Iran competing against Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. They've made significant investments and inroads into the African continent. And the reality is that Iran is losing market share. And so that's one of the drivers, too, that's going on here. And Agnes is also, I do think, correct that two of the countries that the Iranian president visited have very difficult relationships with the West at the moment. And that definitely is Uganda and Zimbabwe. Kenya, I think, is a different case. It's got good relations with many countries. But there, I think the Kenyans rightly are looking to diversify their relations. And the strategy of diversification rightly includes Iran amongst many others. And so I think we need to look at it slightly differently in that regard.
Fair enough. Alex, just quickly, though, do you see any kind of potential for unfair exploitation, again, in the Iran-Africa trade relationship, or do you think this one will be more balanced?
Look, the message from Tehran is that Iran is different. It's unlike the West and many other countries. The relationship's built on mutual interest and respect. Everybody is saying that. And so this is up to African countries to hold these partnerships to account and ensure that they are equal and that they get the value that they want. Iran wants to strike deals. Iranian business people are as hard-nosed as anybody else. This is not about charity. And I think this is really where, it's up to African governments to have good strategies and good vision of what they want, hopefully developmental, because the majority of African countries that we're talking about, including the three that we've visited, priority number one is to develop, reduce poverty, and get economic growth. I was in Kenya until Sunday morning. I'm just arrived here in Nigeria. In Kenya, everybody is talking about how to get economic growth, how to get more investment, how to create jobs, better education, and so on.
Okay, Mohammad, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, but also there's this issue as well that, the Gulf states that deal with Africa also allow Africans to come work in the Gulf and grow the economy of their African countries through remittances, very important part of a lot of the GDP in certain African nations. Can Iran compete with that?
Iran has roughly 5 million people from Afghanistan living in the country as refugees as we speak. So I think that Iran has probably more refugees than any other country in the world. And Iran doesn't get any real support from institutions, international institutions dominated by Western countries, because they want to keep as much pressure on Iran as possible. So I don't think there is much of a market for citizens from African countries because of the large number of non-Iranians who already reside here. But Iran's needs are very different from that of Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Persian Gulf region, because Iran has industrial products. It produces a lot of goods on its own. A lot of it is because of the sanctions. And those goods are much less expensive for these African countries than Western goods. And therefore, they've welcomed Iranian goods and services and medical companies to produce in their countries. At least in these three countries, and Iran needs the agricultural goods that these countries produce because they're less expensive and they're more convenient. But also, there's another point as well that the Iranians are looking at, and that is that Iran is developing a north-south corridor along with the Russians, alongside and through the Caspian Sea, both through the shipping lanes in the Caspian Sea and to the east and to the west of the Caspian Sea. And also is developing another transit route to Central Asia, and of course the Belt and Road would be connected to that. So through these transport corridors that are being rapidly developed, these African countries and other African countries would have, and especially Kenya, being a business hub, would have access to new markets, meaning Russia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Eastern China and Eastern Russia. So, and of course, but the vice versa is true as well. So Iran sees this as an opportunity for it to become increasingly a hub for trade, for re-exports, and to be a transport corridor for different players in Africa and to the north of Iran.
Okay, Agnes, quickly, I mean, would you agree there? I mean, because it does sound like Africa has a lot to gain and that there is truly a mutually beneficial relationship here between Africa and Iran in this trade.
Look, it's great to be optimistic, but just before I respond, I just wanted to say to Alex that I do not allude that there is a competition. Of course, Iran cannot begin to compete with the US or the EU. If you look at the volume of trade between the EU, like, for example, with Africa, about $3.3 billion. The US and Kenya is $1.1 billion. So there is no comparison, there is no competition. However, why is this story a headline? It's because it's Iran that has had US sanctions visiting countries that have close relationship with the continent. My comment, and I agree with you that yes, this relationship has to be seen from what is beneficial to the African continent. It's just going to be another agreement. Chinese have also very cheap products. The products from Russia or Turkey, they're equally cheap than from Europe. So it is what is valuable for the continent. Of course, trade relations, if they can develop and help citizens out of poverty, they're most welcome. But my point is, we shouldn't be celebrating or going to the bank yet. These MOUs, for me, as just another opportunity to just position. It's just another opportunity, and Africa become a playing ground for geopolitics.
Agnes, let me stick with you for a minute and just change tact slightly here, because I need to ask about this subject. We raised it in the introduction because leaders on both sides commented specifically on this. And how strong, really, is the pull of ultra-conservative religious policy, regardless of the actual religion? Iran's and Uganda's governments, in many ways, have similar idea on social policy. Is that helping to build a different kind of bond, for better or worse, in your opinion?
I think, and you followed the story in Uganda. President Raisi focused on the issues of LGBTQ and the social African values and cultural values, right? So he touched on issues and themes that he knows strike very closely to many Africans, particularly Ugandans, but also this relation, the fact that, as you said, cultural values between Iranians and East Africans are probably very close, so it probably make it easier for them to penetrate or to have market access or better relations with the West, and also that they're not viewed as former colonial masters, so maybe the relationship may be better. But yes, so conservatives in Uganda mostly welcome President Raisi's statement on issues that matter to them. I'm not sure whether that would be the same in Kenya or Zimbabwe.
Let me ask Alex if you think the sharing these religious conservative views helps bolster Iran, or could it actually backfire in some senses?
It depends where you're talking about. I mean, there are a number of countries in West Africa where it hasn't worked. There had to be an expulsion here in Nigeria some years ago of a cleric that was proselytizing, extremism, and Nigerian government had to expel him. On the other hand, Iran is investing in and has deepening its partnership with Mauritania. I tend to think that the whole issue around in Uganda is about the increased pressure that President Museveni of Uganda is under from the West, and so the LGBTQ issue is being used as a kind of pushback on that, and that's not a key issue for Ugandans. Ugandans are also really being impacted heavily by inflation, by the lack of growth of their economy, and those are the issues that are being concerned. I mean, Iran's going to have to be very careful about wanting to bring in food from Africa. There are food shortages in the continent, and even just in the last few hours, the Black Sea deal that Russia had agreed with Ukraine for the export of grain has been reversed. That's going to put even more inflation and more pressure on Africa's agricultural production. So maybe Iranian good offices on Russia to reverse that, I think, would be a really important thing.
Indeed. It's interesting you brought that in. Mohammad Marandi, if you'd like to comment on that. I mean, yes, it makes sense to trade, the agricultural products Iran needs for the petroleum products, for example, that some African nations are looking for. But at this point, food is not as readily available as it used to be. And there may be some serious competition for those specific African resources.
Well, the Iranians are working with the Russians to export or re-export Russian grains. And Iran does import grain from Russia itself. And the commodities that the Iranians are looking to purchase from these African countries are commodities that are in excess. These are commodities that these countries export. And the Iranians see that their prices are more favorable than that which, for example, we have in Australia. And the Australians will not import Iranian goods, whereas these African countries wish to do so. So it's for Iran, this is much more favorable, and these African countries also receive less expensive goods, which also the Iranians are willing to transfer technology as well. So yes, I think that in future there's going to be a serious issue with food shortage because of the standoff between NATO and Russia, and all countries have to help push the region, Eurasia, towards peace. But there's also one point that I'd like to make, and that is that actually the Raisi government is a very left-leaning government, and social justice is one of the key slogans of his administration. The previous administration, the president was more liberal capitalist. This administration is more leftist, speaking in older traditional terms. And in fact, for example, abortion in Iran, the laws linked to abortion are more open than they are in southern states and in the United States, or the changing of genders in Iran, the operations that are carried out in Iran under certain laws and regulations have been, these have been taking place for years now. So I think a lot of the information that exists about Iran comes from the Western media, which has always been traditionally hostile. Iran is a much more complicated and sophisticated place than it would appear. Often my Western colleagues who come to Iran, they come with big and heavy bags, and when I ask them what's in them, they say the canned food, because a lot of them think that Iran is like there's a war going on. But Iran is a very developed country. It has there are no food shortages.
Story of the world, actually, so much misunderstanding of how these countries are internally. Yeah, understood. Very quickly, though, we're down to our last minute, though. So Agnes, I needed to get to one last issue. And you may think this is a non-issue, actually, but some have been talking about potential pushback, if we should expect any, really, from the United States, even China for that matter, but particularly the United States. If we're looking at sanctions again, and perhaps in the U.S., if a more conservative government takes place or it takes power in the next election, should African nations be worried about their position with Iran and how the U.S. or even China may respond, or no?
Not at all. I don't think so. A focus on Iran is not a change of policy by the African government or the countries it's visited. It just means they haven't changed their pro-West policies. It just means they are bringing more partners, as Alex alluded to promote economic development and lift their citizens out of poverty. So I should not expect any reactions from the U.S. or the beggable West.
Alex, quickly, you're on the same page there, yeah? This can work. If it works in everyone's benefit?
Yeah, I don't think we should be doctrinal. You're completely right, though, that, you know, for example, in a scenario where there's a Trump administration, I mean, anything related to Iran is a red rag. But I do think from an African perspective, multiple partners is a good thing as long as you know exactly what you want from them.
Sounds good. Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, I'd like to thank all three of my panelists for joining us, Mohammad Marandi, Agnes Gitau, and Alex Vines. That's all we have for this edition of The Newsmakers. Thanks to our viewers for being with us, of course. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.